David Hume was a Scottish philosopher, historian, economist, and exotic fashion icon. He believed that simple ideas can only be derived from simple impressions. For example, the color red is a simple idea. This makes sense because you cannot break the idea of red into any more simpler ideas. And you also cannot conceive of the idea of red without ever having experienced it before. Hume called this the copy principle. So okay, simple ideas are derived from simple impressions. But what about complex ideas? Well, a red chair is a complex idea. So if you have experienced the simple idea of red and the simple idea of a chair, you can easily conceive the complex idea of a red chair without ever having actually seen or experienced it before. That's pretty neat, right? Well, Hume wrote about the copy principle mainly in two of his works. First, a treatise of human nature, and second, an inquiry concerning human understanding. But in both works, just a few paragraphs later after explaining the copy principle, he presents a thought experiment called the missing shade of blue. It goes like this. Suppose we have a person who is perfectly well acquainted with colors of all kinds, except for a particular shade of blue. Now he is presented with an array of different shades of blue with one shade missing in the middle, which happens to be the same shade that he has never experienced before. As you can tell, the shades of blue are moving from lighter to deeper. So Hume asserts that the person would be able to conceive of the missing shade of blue, and thus this example serves as a contradiction to his copy principle. But instead of expanding on this issue further, he chooses to ignore this example altogether, stating it as a singular occurrence. In his own words, he says this instance is so singular that it's scarce worth our observing and does not merit that we should alter the general maxim. Some would call it intellectual honesty on his part, but to me this is pretty much Hume's way of cock-blocking philosophy nerds. But on a serious note, what the missing shade of blue thought experiment has done over the years, apart from increasing Hume's book sales, is it has invited a lot of varying responses to the ironic situation. For example, many philosophers have since argued that Hume's thought experiment is actually not a contradiction to his copy principle, by stating that colors are not simple ideas. Others have said that even though this is a gray area in the copy principle, but Hume was just being ironic, as his declared method of carrying out the experiment is actually undoable. It's impossible for someone to know whether they had or had not seen a missing shade before. I am not covering all the responses to this problem in the video because I'm lazy. So I'll just leave you with the question. What do you come up with when you look at the missing shade of blue? And are you really seeing it for the first time? If you are anything like me, you want your life to always be a little more pleasurable, be it food or drinks or any other pleasurable activities. A person who believes that the pursuit of pleasure is the most important thing in life is a bad person as per your mom, but as per philosophy is a hedonist. While in today's time, hedonism is viewed in a pretty bad light, this was not always the case. The idea that pleasure is the only good can be found at the core of many ancient philosophies. For example, hedonism's first mention can be found in the Epic of Gilgamesh, where a character called Shiduri gives the following advice. Fill your belly, day and night make merry, let days be full of joy, dance and make music day and night. These things alone are the concerns of men. This may represent the first recorded advocacy of hedonism. After these, the Epicureans and the Indian Charvaka philosophies also place hedonism at the center of their value systems. In the modern world, utilitarians take this idea even forward and believe that the end goal of all actions should be directed towards achieving the greatest total amount of happiness possible. Wholesome as that sounds, some philosophers had their reservations against this idea. The most notable one being the experience machine thought experiment proposed by Robert Nozick. Nozick, in his 1974 book Anarchy, State and Utopia, describes a machine that could provide whatever desirable or pleasurable experiences that a subject could want. Psychologists have figured out a way to stimulate a person's brain to induce these experiences such that the subject cannot distinguish them from reality. So, would you plug yourself in? Most people would instinctively answer this question with a no, and Nozick acknowledges this outcome as well. We want to actually do things, he says, and not just have the experience of doing so. This conclusion flies in the face of hedonism and the basic utilitarian framework. Or so Nozick thought. Consider a variation of the experience machine proposed by another philosopher, Philip de Brigard, where the situation is reversed. You wake up one day in a hospital and a woman in a white coat explains to you that the year is 2659. And several years before, your past self chose to enter the experience machine. So, would you like to unplug now? Surprisingly, in this case, most people are willing to stay plugged into the machine, especially if they were told that their life outside was more miserable than on the inside. This reveals that while Nozick's assumption that people value something more than just pleasure is correct, it is not because we are noble or truth-seeking by any means. It's only because we exhibit a kind of inertia about the way things are right now. Pretty anticlimactic, if you ask me. Wait a minute, aren't TVs and phones primitive experience machines in some sense? And if I'm already spending half of my life doom scrolling through Instagram, how bad could the real thing be? The trolley problem is one of the most popular thought experiments in philosophy. It usually begins with a scenario where a runaway trolley is on course to collide with and kill a bunch of people, traditionally 5. But a bystander can intervene and divert the vehicle to kill just one person on a different track. If the bystander subscribes to the utilitarian view, he would go ahead and divert the train. After all, saving 5 people over 1 would result in overall greater net good for the world. And most people would also agree to this, at least in a thought experiment. But consider another variation where instead of diverting the train, you have to push a very fat man on the track to save the 5 people. Would you hold the same position as last time? The common answer to this question is no. However, from a utilitarian perspective, there is no difference between the first and the second situation. Finally, consider this. You're a doctor and you need to kill one of your patients and transplant their organs to save the other 5. Would you go ahead and do the transplant? Again, the general answer is a no here. But this time the utilitarian might argue that this is because the doctor has taken a Hippocratic oath, and in case he carries out the transplant, it would lead to general distrust against doctors in society, which would in turn cause more net harm in the world. After all, nobody wants to live in a world where your organs can simply be harvested one day to save more people's lives. But it is very simple to move past these constraints. For instance, we can replace the doctor with any normal person who just happens to know how to perform a transplant. And we can imagine it as an isolated event in some top secret lab, so nobody would ever find out about the transplant on the outside. So, would you then be justified to carry out the transplant? I get the impression that it would still be a no for most people. The trolley experiment and its variations do an amazing job at highlighting how there can never be a rigid set of morals in society. One's morality will always depend on the individual and the proposed circumstances. Instead of finding a correct answer to this problem, we should observe how people navigate their moral compasses in the face of a tense situation, and how quickly their morality changes as the experiment becomes more and more involved. In a profound way, it also explains why war is so easy to start. Because people that are pushing the buttons are almost never on the battlefield. I realize now that this segment got a bit too serious, so to lighten things up, I suggest you check out the Trolley Meme subreddit, where you can find out all kinds of variations of the trolley problem. Like the lazy person's trolley problem, where you are too lazy to pull the lever. Or the trolley is Thomas the Tank Engine problem. Or get this, the hedonist trolley problem, where 5 people will die no matter what, but if you pull the lever, the trolley does a sick flip. Love this one. Or the Uber driver trolley problem. Or the very notorious toddler's take on the trolley problem, who I get the feeling will grow up to be president one day. And my absolute favorite, the girlfriend trolley problem, where you kidnap your girlfriend's entire family and use them as subjects for carrying out the experiment. Just brilliant. The question of what constitutes as knowledge is as old as philosophy itself. We can trace this question all the way back to Plato's dialogues, most notably the Theaetetus, where Socrates and a young mathematician attempt to come up with a definition of knowledge. This dialogue very quickly became the basis of an entire branch in philosophy known as epistemology, the study of episteme, or knowledge as it's called in Greek. For almost 2000 years, we safely relied on the definition of knowledge that Plato provided to us. He defined knowledge as a justified true belief, or JTB. For example, imagine that you're in a desert and you happen to see a blue expanse at a distance. In this case, you can form the belief that there is water nearby. This belief is justified because you saw the blue expanse from afar. And when you actually walk towards it, your belief also turns out to be true, as there indeed is a pond filled with water nearby. So your belief that there is water nearby is a justified true belief, and thus can be equated with knowledge. One can clearly see why Plato's definition of knowledge went unchallenged for more than 2 millennia. It's intuitive and very straightforward. But in 1963, almost out of nowhere, this tripartite definition of knowledge would have to come to terms with a very serious problem. Edmund Gettier was an American philosopher at the Wayne State University. He was about to lose his tenure at the university because the authorities wanted him to publish a paper. Any paper about anything at all, as he was not considered prolific enough by his own colleagues. So to get people off his back, he decided to quickly write a 3-page paper about something outside his own field and sent it off to a journal. The 3-page long paper completely broke open epistemology in the 20th century. and Gettier with his 3 pages became the most quoted, cited, and influential philosopher in all of epistemology. In the paper, Gettier showed that Plato's JTB definition of knowledge was incomplete. By means of 2 counterexamples, Gettier was able to show that there are cases where we can have justified true beliefs, but still fail to equate them with knowledge. Consider the example of the desert again. You again saw a blue expanse at a distance and formed the belief that water is nearby. Your belief was justified because a blue expanse usually correlates with a water body. Except this time it's only a mirage. But when you walk towards the mirage, you do end up finding water. It was just hidden under a rock. So we have a case of a justified true belief, but did you actually have the knowledge while hallucinating in the desert that there was water nearby? Or was it just a happy accident? Situations like these where we have a JTB with an element of epistemic luck are now known as Gettier problems. And that's it. That's basically the entire paper. 2000 years of big brain philosophy from Plato to Locke to Hume to Kant, and nobody thought of factoring in luck into the equation. Well, nobody except for the frantic and not so prolific colleague at Wayne State University.